I'm Dave Greve. I am giving the paper. Ben Chorpening is in the audience, and he can answer any questions that have to do specifically with the flow aspects of this project. I'll be talking about Doppler sensing of unsteady dense particulate flows. This work was conducted at the National Energy Technology Laboratory, and this is a outline of what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about chemical looping, which is the type of combustion reactor that we're interested in here. I will explain briefly what microwave Doppler looks like, and then I'll talk about some measurements of flow using the Doppler system and another technique in a particular portion of the combustion system. So what is chemical looping? It's one scheme of several for producing an exhaust from a combustion system which is nearly pure carbon dioxide. The idea here is if we can produce an exhaust which consists of carbon dioxide plus water vapor, we can condense the water vapor out, and the carbon dioxide can be sequestered into the ground, and therefore it would not be emitted into the atmosphere. Now let me see. Yes, this is a pointer. Okay, what a chemical looping reactor does, air is injected into a column where it is mixed with oxygen carrier particles. Those oxygen carrier particles are transported into a fuel reactor without having the air mix with the fuel reactor environment. In the fuel reactor, the oxygen carrier particles react with coal particles or with natural gas, and since there's nothing but oxygen over here, that means the exhaust will be carbon dioxide plus water vapor. The water vapor can be condensed, the carbon dioxide can be sequestered into the ground. There are other ways to do this. The interesting thing about the chemical looping system is that it doesn't require separation of oxygen or the use of complex schemes for separating carbon dioxide from other components of the exhaust. Now, one of the key things about this type of combustion system is that we have particles which are being transported by a flow of gas, and those particles are what carries the oxygen from one place to another. And flow of those particles is clearly an important aspect of designing and understanding such a system. There exists at NETL a chemical looping reactor on a small scale meaning only a few 30 or 40 feet in height. This is a photograph over here of the reactor, and this is a cross-sectional diagram showing what it looks like. The key problem here is that the sensing environment is high temperature and high pressure. Now, on a previous conference, we have talked about a microwave Doppler sensor which goes up here, where it turns out that the flow is relatively dilute. Today I'm going to talk about sensing somewhere down here where we have the transport of these particles in nearly, in a fairly dense form in wave-like intermittent motion. So this is a very different sensing problem than the one which takes place up here. Now, I am not going to talk about measurements which are done in that combustion reactor. I'm going to talk about measurements which are done in what is called a cold flow system. That is a system that operates at room temperature and is intended mostly to study the aspects of the flow environment itself. So since we're talking about measurements which are at room temperature, we don't need to use particles that are stable at high temperature. What we use instead are high-density polyethylene particles which look like this. By the way, the geometry on the inside of the cold flow reactor is exactly the same as the geometry of the combustion reactor. So what we will be doing is looking down here, not up there as we did on a previous presentation. This is called the L valve down here, and we will be looking at what happens if we transport particles down here over into the air reactor. And one way of characterizing that transport is to measure the pressure difference between the bottom and the top of the bed, and that can be used to get a measure of the flow rate of those particles. What you see here are measurements of that pressure difference at two places. One is over here and one is over there, and that is pressure as a function of time. So what's happening in this graph is that we are basically transporting particles from this bed over to this bed. That means that the particles over here are increasing in number and they're decreasing over here. So one of these pressure differences goes down, the other one goes up. There is some theory which allows you to take those pressure differences and turn them into mass flow rates. There are some assumptions that are involved in making that calculation. This is the result of doing that calculation. So this is a flux of particles in kilograms per second as a function of time. What's happening here is that we're moving the particles from one bed to another. We're not doing a complete circulation of the particles. So what we see is just a general decrease in the time-dependent decrease in the rate of mass transport. Now, down at that bottom of the system, the transport is actually happening in an intermittent wave-like sense, but it's not visible in this graph. This is just showing the average transport of those particles. To look at that wave-like transport, we're going to use a microwave Doppler system. This is a block diagram of the microwave Doppler system. We have a microwave source. Part of that energy goes into a circulator and it is emitted by a horn. The reflected energy from the moving particles goes back into the horn and circulates around to a mixer where it's mixed with a portion of the microwave energy. And then we get a signal at the output which is at a low frequency, and the frequency depends on the difference in frequency between the Doppler shifted signal and the original source. This is the equation that relates the shift of frequency to the angle at which this horn is incident on the particles and the frequency and velocity of the system, velocity of motion and the frequency of operation. Now, for Doppler measurements with a single particle, what we see is something which looks like this. This is the power spectrum coming out of that detected system as a function of frequency. In other words, we see a peak at a single frequency. If we have multiple particles, they enter the sampling domain at different times. We get interference between the different individual reflections, and we end up with a spiky-looking spectrum, but we still nevertheless see a peak at a frequency that corresponds to the average velocity of those particles. So to illustrate what's going on, one way to handle this is to make a short time Fourier transform and make a time frequency plot. So this is the frequency shift as a function of time, and we have a flow of particles which has started over here and ended over there. Red indicates a high intensity of my Fourier transform, so this line here indicates the most probable velocity. You'll notice the frequency shifts are pretty small. This is about 25 hertz. Okay, this movie here shows an animation of the wave-like motion of these particles observed using a high-speed camera. So you can see that this is the entire height of the transport region. You can see that it's partly full of particles, and you can see that those particles move in a wave-like motion, then they're stationary for a while, then they move again, and so on and so forth. And the key thing we want to do is we want to observe that motion using the microwave Doppler. By the way, the velocities that we're talking about are really not very high, which makes it desirable to use a high frequency for the microwave Doppler measurement. We are using 24 gigahertz. Okay, what we wanted to do is to compare the velocities extracted from the optical or video studies with the velocities obtained using the microwave Doppler system. So that means we need to extract a velocity from the images. And we did that by taking sequential frames of the video and performing a cross-correlation and using that cross-correlation to extract a velocity vector. So this shows a stationary motion, and in this case, there was no net transport detected by doing our cross-correlation. And if we do the cross-correlation, what you can see, if you look very, very closely, are two velocity vectors, which are the computed velocities for domains at two different places in this flow region. So we can extract a velocity vector from our video measurements. We can use that to compare with what we get from our microwave Doppler measurements. Okay, this is a time plot of the detected Doppler signal as a function of time. This is from 0 seconds to 10 seconds. So there was wave-like motion taking place, and you can see that wave-like motion as these little blips here in the Doppler signal. In between those wave-like motions, the Doppler signal is nearly static. If we blow up this region over here, we can see something like this, and you can see some sinusoidal dependence over here. That corresponds to the frequency shift that is associated with the Doppler signal. So we see near constant signal when the particle mass is stationary, and we see a oscillatory behavior when the particles are moving. Okay, what we are doing is we're going to show synchronized measurements from both that high-speed video study and the microwave Doppler study. What you see here is a photograph of the region that is under investigation. It's filled, or mostly filled, with the plastic particles. You can even see the beginnings of a wave over here. This is the microwave Doppler horn. And this region over here corresponds to this place down here near what's called the L valve. What we did is we collected several data sets of both video and Doppler data during the same test as the valve, as the flow during the L valve decreased. And we made composite plots of the detected Doppler signal, the particle number, velocity from the video, and that short time Fourier transform that I told you about earlier. Okay, so this is a diagram to indicate what we did. The experiments were performed in the cold flow system with a transparent L valve. We created a time-varying flow in the L valve. We collected high-speed video, and we also collected synchronized microwave Doppler data. The video, we did two things with it. By the way, that was at 500 frames per second. We did the cross-correlation to extract the velocity vectors, and we counted the number of particles in the frame using an image analysis utility, and we also plotted that. From the microwave Doppler, which is sampled at 10,000 samples per second, we performed the short-time Fourier transform. That resulted in that short-time Fourier transform I showed you, and then we plot that. And all of that goes together into a time-synchronized composite plot. And here is one of them. Okay, up at the top is the raw Doppler signal. You see those blips that correspond to the intermittent motion. This is the total particle number as a function of time. That total particle number is nearly constant in between these flow events, and then it changes during those flow events. Using that image data, we can also extract the velocity. This is the x component of velocity, which is extracted from sequential video frames, and you see that that x component of velocity shows non-zero values only where the flow is occurring. Those velocities are negative because x increases that way and the motion is that way. And finally, down here we have the short-time Fourier transform. This is 1 meter per second and this is 2 meters per second, plotted as a function of time. The places where we have significant velocity extracted from the short time Fourier transform line up very nicely with the, all right, this is another one slightly later in the flow sequence where you see that the flow is more intermittent. Once again, the velocities are in reasonable agreement between the Doppler measurement and the video measurement. Conclusion, microwave Doppler is sensitive to intermittent dense flow. We verified it with the video. We can see things that we don't see in the pressure data. There is potential for use in chemical looping process control, and we're going to look at other particles and high temperature sensing later. Done.